Seun means, it's taken from the Chinese characters for world and fortune. So basically it means global fortune. They were very optimistic when they built this place about what it would become and what it would do for the city and for the area. Obviously things didn't work out that way. Hello there, it is a Saturday afternoon and I am at Jongno, Bell Street, specifically the 4th block. Right across the street here, the green area over there is Zhongmyo. It's a shrine, a Confucian shrine that was constructed in the early days of the Joseon dynasty, around 1394. And I don't know a whole lot about it. I know it was intended to honor the memories of deceased kings and queens of the Joseon dynasty, and there's still an annual ceremony that happens there, but I don't know a whole lot about it, so I'll talk about that another day. Today we're here to talk about, in part, this building right here, Seunshanga, also called Maker City Seun, and several other buildings that are off in that direction. Now, I came out here yesterday and I stood right down there and started my introduction, you know, hello there, it's Friday. And I spent a few hours out here talking about Seun because I was pretty excited that I had learned something new. You know, this part of Seoul, this area where Seunshanga is, you know, from right over here from the 3rd block of Jongno and down that way, and, you know, off east toward Dongdaemun, this part of Seoul was pretty much a blank void to me. I never spent any time here. I passed through occasionally on a bus or a taxi, but I just never had a reason to come here. And when I did come here, you know, back in my 20s, this just didn't interest me. This area is very, you know, old and industrial, and there were shops where people were making things, and the buildings were old and dilapidated and, you know, didn't look very historical, so it just didn't grab my interest back then, and I just ignored it. And it's only in the last few years since we've moved to our current location that I've been walking through this area on my daily walks, and I really love the place now. But unfortunately it's a little bit too late, I think. But anyway, I didn't really realize that these similar looking buildings that I was seeing between Jongno and Daegyeoro down there, Jungmuro Station, I didn't realize that these buildings were actually part of a single complex. Originally, there were 8 buildings on this site. Today, there are only 7. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that to you today. So you may be wondering why I'm back out here to film again if I was out here filming yesterday. And it's just because of a little bit of serendipity. I wasn't happy last night with the way the editing was going, and I decided to sleep on it and come back at it with fresh eyes this morning. But then this morning, when I woke up on a whim, I did another search to see, I was trying to do some fact checking on a couple of things I wasn't clear about, and I stumbled upon a couple of sources I hadn't seen before, and that opened up a whole new world of information to me. So this new information solved my editing problem, and it also gave me a different approach to talking about this very interesting part of modern Seoul history. And we're going to start right here because we can see that this land, the strip of land that it's on, from this side to this side, it maintains the width for about 1 kilometer in that direction, all the way down to Taegyeoro at Chungmuro Station, very near Chungmuro Station. And this land has had this shape since 1945. In the closing days of World War II, the occupying Japanese government here were concerned that the US would bomb Seoul. So they cleared this strip of land here as a fire break. After the war, from what I can tell, from what I understand, the strip of land remained pretty much empty. But then after the Korean War, a lot of squatters came in because you had a lot of people who were displaced during the war. And so this shanty town grew up here along the entirety of the kilometer strip, just as it did around, Cheonggye Stream. So during the 1960s, as Seoul was being redeveloped, the Seoul mayor proposed an idea for this strip of land, a mixed commercial and residential complex. So the city tapped an architect by the name of Kim Soo-gun, well, his firm, to handle the design of this mixed commercial residential complex. And over his career, Kim became like the most influential architect in Korea, arguably. And he designed actually a number of buildings that have stood out to me, over the years. Some of them I pass on a regular basis. There are 3 that I walked by yesterday on my way here, all of them in the vicinity of Dongguk University. There's the Gyeongdong Presbyterian Church, which I think was 1980. And then you have a couple from the 60s, the Freedom Center, on one side of which, one of the big parking lots, there was a drive-in movie theater for many years. I don't think that was there originally, but it's gone now. And also the Tower Hotel. Well, what used to be the Tower Hotel. It's now the Banyan Tree, and with the development of the Banyan Tree, it was completely remodeled on the exterior. Well, I assume the interior too, but the exterior looks nothing like it did before the Banyan Tree took it over. And that one I remember because, it always stood out to me. It was just always there, rising off the hill. Anytime you were in that area, it was a landmark. So the original design included 8 buildings with a skyway connecting all of them. And the whole thing was going to be called Sehun Plaza. And each section of 2 buildings, each block of 2 buildings would be named Sehun Plaza A, Sehun Plaza B. Well, in Korean, it would be Sehun Sanga, Gadong, Sehun Sanga, Nadong, and so on. Gadong, Nadong, Radong, whatever. That was the original concept. Block A, Block B, Block C. And the structure of each building, though the heights would vary, the structure would be basically the same. You have the lower floors are an arcade, a shopping center, shopping mall. And on each side of the building is a sidewalk, a pedestrian walkway, and next to that is a one-way street for vehicles. And then on the other side of the streets, you have another pedestrian walkway, a sidewalk. And then above the shops, the arcades, you had space for offices and then residential areas, apartments. And these at the time were luxury apartments. There were 4 different construction firms that were each given a contract to build one block of the plaza. And the construction took place over a period of 5 years. So this first block, the Sehun-sanga Gadong, when the ribbon cutting ceremony happened, was July 1967. It didn't officially get approval to open for operation until the end of the year. So, you know, you often hear that Saewoon Plaza opened in 1968, but it was officially granted authorization in November of 1967, and the commercial spaces were open for the ribbon cutting ceremony in July of 1967. And so this was the only one standing. And then the next blocks were opened. And ultimately what happened is the Skyway was never completed, right? Not all of the buildings were connected by the Skyway. You had one right here that goes across Cheonggye Stream, but what's there now is not the original. The original was demolished several years ago. But, and ultimately, each building, instead of the blocks being named, you know, alphabetically, each building was given its own name, and usually one of the names was from the construction company. So here, this building, which was originally part of Saewoon Sanga Gadong, became Saewoon Sanga, right? Saewoon Plaza or Saewoon Arcade. And the building that was right here in front of it, but is no longer there, was named after the construction firm that built it, which was Hyundai. And so it was called Hyundai Plaza or Hyundai Arcade. So I'm on the ground floor of the Saewoon Arcade, and you know, here you can see this is the walkway next to the building, and you know, because it's Saturday, a lot of the shops are shuttered. Yesterday they were all open, and you see the street here, the one-way street, for vehicular traffic, and then there's another walkway over there, and then we have the deck above us. And if you wander around these shops and you go inside the building, you'll find that everything here is electronics. There are all kinds of electronics shops in this building. And that's because when Saewoon Plaza first opened, this became a hotspot for electronics. So apparently there were already some electronics shops in the area. And so this became the electronics mecca, I guess, if you will, through most of the 70s. And, you know, this is where you came for cameras and radio equipment, and in later days, you know, VCRs and DVDs, and look at all this. You've got speakers, right? A lot of this stuff is still here. Today you can find, you know, karaoke machines and arcade games and all kinds of stuff, electronics related, even components. So as the 70s progressed, an ecosystem, a self-sustaining ecosystem, developed in the alleyways around Seiwon Plaza. A core of it was already here, but it just grew and grew and grew as you had all these artisans and craftspeople move in and open up little shops to start making all kinds of things, electronics components and machine shops, you know, metalworking shops and print shops and all kinds of stuff, right? And it was self-sustaining in that if you were an artisan making something, you could find the components you needed here in this area. And so it was this network of makers and suppliers supporting each other that grew up around here. And you know, this is something that kind of bums me out today, is that, you know, in my 20s, I just didn't take an interest in this area because all that was here were, you know, these little shops making things that just did not grab my interest. And now I look at all these buildings and, you know, what's left of those days, and it's probably not going to be around much longer. Apparently, even as early as 1979, there was some talk about doing something to redesign or redevelop or reinvigorate Seiwon Plaza, because through the 70s, despite this thriving electronics market that had grown up here, the upper decks in particular had kind of gotten a little bit of a seedy reputation because it was easy for vendors up here to sell illicit goods out of the way of, you know, the prying eyes of the law. So, you know, for example, pornography and, you know, LPs of groups and, you know, certain kinds of music that were banned at the time. So there was some talk of redeveloping even in the late 70s there. And then into the 80s, the commercial situation in Korea changed. Myeongdong started to become a more popular shopping area. Yongsan Electronics Market grew up and became basically by 1987 the place to go for electronics. You had all these apartments that had been constructed all over the city, which kind of made these luxury apartments throughout Seiwon Plaza lose their luster. And on top of that, a lot of people just thought these buildings were ugly, right? Various public polls over the years have shown that people just did not like the look of these buildings. And so there were, at different points, beginning in 1979, discussions about what to do about the decline and the decay. There was some movement in that direction in the late 90s, but then the economic crisis kind of put a stop to that. And so nothing happened again until the 2000s. In 2008 or so, the entirety of Seiwon Plaza was designated for demolition. And one building did get demolished, and that was the one that was standing right here, the one called Hyundai Arcade. Originally, when Hyundai Arcade was demolished, it was replaced by a green space. And you can see in this picture right here, this is what Seiwon Arcade looked like at the time. And you can see it doesn't say Maker City Seiwon, that's a recent thing. It says Seiwon Chungcha Sanga, which means Seiwon Electronics Arcade. And you can also see here this picture on the building, which is a mock-up of what the entire kilometer strip of land would look like. The entire thing was going to be turned into a green space. But that didn't happen. And part of the reason was the global financial crisis of 2008. And according to that chapter excerpt, that book excerpt that I found this morning, another part of the reason was this: Jongmyo. because this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the committee they have, the International, goodness, I'm going to have to look it up, but the committee that they have that determines the status of heritage sites supposedly threatened to remove the status of Jeongmyo Shrine if the area around it was filled with high-rise apartment buildings. So that may have played a factor as well. So after Hyundai Arcade was demolished, the government opened up a competition to determine what to do with Saeun Plaza. And so, you know, you had feedback from residents and developers, people who wanted to replace it. The residents were extremely opposed to replacing it, and, you know, on and on and on. But eventually what happened is they decided to do something the original developers had never done, and that was complete the sky deck, right? So the concept was you complete the sky deck and you do it in a way that you can give views of the city around Saeun Plaza. And at the same time, they wanted to encourage artisans to come in and take up residence with their shops, right? That's why this is called Maker City, right? This was going to become the core of the maker community in the area that already existed here, right? So that was the concept. And so there were two phases to this project. And the first phase was done by a Korean architectural firm. And their concept was something like grounding the building, right? Grounding the skyway. And so that's why we have this ramp here in front of Saeun Arcade. And we're just under the ramp right now. And right below us here, they now have on display these foundations from the Joseon Dynasty buildings that once stood here. And you can also see just right there is one of the foundation columns, foundation poles of the Hyundai Arcade with the rebar sticking up out of it. And this project was called the Dashi Saeun project. Dashi means again, and in English I've seen it referred to as the Re-Saeun project, which I really like. That's a better name than Again Saeun in English. So part of the phase one of the project was this pedestrian bridge here over Cheonggye Stream, because this was one section where the sky bridge had been, completed. There had been originally a pedestrian bridge here connecting the Cheonggye Arcade with the Saeun Arcade, but it was demolished, I think, in 2004 when the Cheonggye Restoration Project was underway. So Cheonggye Stream, because it had become such a dirty slum after the Korean War, it was heavily redeveloped in the 1960s, around the same time that the Saeun Plaza was being constructed. So it was, covered for many, many years, and there was a street here, and there was an overpass that ran above us here, right? The entrance to the overpass was down at the other end by Gwanghwamun, and you would go up, and it just ran on. When I was coming from downtown in a taxi to Itaewon, taxis would often take me on the overpass and onto Sewol-ro to go over Namsan to Itaewon. So I really don't remember much of what was down here. I don't remember seeing the pedestrian bridges. I don't remember any of that, unfortunately. But yeah, so they restored the pedestrian bridge here as part of phase one. So phase one of the Re-Saeun project covered this buildings here, these three buildings here, the first two blocks of the plaza. And phase two starts right here. Phase two was awarded to an Italian design firm, and this is what they came up with. very different in style to the rest of the place. But here's the thing. This part right here, these next two buildings, this is a Sampoong Nexus. It used to be Sampoong Sangha. At some point, I don't know when, it was renamed to Sampoong Nexus. And next to that, you have the Hotel PJ, which used to be called the Punjung Hotel. But yeah, these buildings were remodeled at some point. And I think some of that happened in 2006, because from what I read, there used to be a deck here on these buildings, just like the other buildings, but those were removed in 2006. And so maybe the remodeling happened then. I can't give you a definitive statement on that one, but this was constructed by the Sampoong Construction Company, if you're wondering why it has the same name as the infamous Sampoong department store. And Sampoong Construction Company went out of business in the late 1990s, 1997, I believe, mostly because of what happened with the Sampoong department store collapse. So you can tell that, you know, the vibe here is very different than in the earlier part of the complex where we were. And, you know, given that the deck had been removed from this building before the project started, this whole pathway here, this whole skyway here is detached from this block of buildings. So you can see, you know, up there where it bends around to the left, it's not, it might look like it's going into, this is the Hotel PJ, it might look like it's going into there, but it's not. It's bending around to connect to the building across the street from the Hotel PJ. But we can get up here and take a look at this view. Now, the thing about this Ree Se Woon project is it was supposed to be a focal point for a revitalization of the whole area, right? Instead of redevelopment, instead of tearing things down and replacing them, let's revitalize. But unfortunately, it didn't, in the end, stop the redevelopment. It only delayed it, paused it. Because in 2018, the bulldozers started coming in again and demolishing a lot of the maker workshops and little small old, you know, buildings that people say are dilapidated and, you know, a fire hazard and everything else, to replace it with things like this. You know, you've got high-rise apartments and office buildings and everything else going up around here on both sides of Se Woon Plaza. So I watched this video by Korea Expose on YouTube. It's from about 5 years ago. And there was an artisan in the video who had had his workshop in the Uchiro area for 50 years. And he is bitterly angry about what's happening. You know, one point that really stood out to me is he says that everybody argues that, you know, these buildings are old, they're dilapidated, they're a fire hazard. And he says, why are they that way? And according to him, the government prevented the people who own these buildings from doing any work to replace the roofs or doing the things necessary that would have made them that would have updated them, made them more, you know, made them safer. But, and he says, you know, after you prevent us from doing that for decades, now you tell us that they're dangerous and they have to be destroyed. So, you know, I don't know all the backstory to that, and I'd like to, so I'm probably going to spend some time, you know, reading up on it and digging into it more. And you know, this is the tension everywhere when it comes to this topic, because, you know, as you want to modernize your city. You want to make it safer and cleaner, make everything sustainable. But at the same time, to make that happen, you're going to have to erase some of the city's past, some of the history, and you are going to put some of the city's residents in difficult situations. You know, when it affects you directly, you have a very, very, very strong reason to take a side. But I'm not an activist in any way, and if you are, you know, there are groups out there that you can join or contribute to that try to fight against all this demolition and reconstruction in Seoul to try to preserve some of the history. So.
When the fire inside that burns so bright begins to grow faded, it can be hard to see the ground on which you stand. Though you may not be afraid of walking in the darkness, you will feel like a stranger in this land. You can try to carve a faith out of your own, but a broken spirit may dry out the bone, and the edges of the night may cause you sorrow. You know, I may not be around this time tomorrow, but I'll always be with you. Yeah, I'll always be with you. When the hope that you hold tightly to has all but vanished, and there are no words of comfort to be found, you will know what it means to be lost and without love. May you fight to kill that deafening sound. But our holy dreams of yesterday aren't gone. They still haunt us like the ghosts of Babylon, and the breaking of the day might bring you sorrow. You know, I may not be around this time tomorrow, but I'll always be with you. I'll always be with you. You can try to carve a faith out of your own, but a broken spirit may dry out the bone, and the edges of the night may cause you sorrow. You know, I may not be around this time tomorrow, but our holy dreams of yesterday aren't gone. They still haunt us like the ghosts of Babylon, and the breaking of the day might bring you sorrow. You know, I may not be around this time tomorrow, but I'll always be with you. I'll always be with you. I'll always be with you. I'll always be with you.
So this is the fourth block. We're close to Taegero and Chungmuro Station. And this building right here, this yellow one, this was originally called Shinsong Sanga. It was constructed by Shinsong Construction Company along with Jinyang Sanga here. And Shinsong Sanga is now, it has a different name. It's called Inhyun Sanga. I don't know the story behind that. And here at Jinyang Sanga, Jinyang Arcade, you have a flower market. So I don't know how long the flower market has been here. I haven't gotten any information on this yet, but yeah, that's pretty cool because I had no idea that there was a flower market right here in downtown Seoul. I know a street market over near Dongdaemun, a flower market on the street, you know, with people selling out of carts, but I had no idea there was anything like this here. My wife always goes to the Yangjae flower market south of Yangjae Station. So what you see here, the floors, there are quite a number of floors here compared to the other buildings. These apartments stretch up a lot higher. But this is the one building that among all the buildings that stand or stood here, this is the one building that I saw more often than any other because I frequently passed by on Taegero, going back and forth between, you know, other parts of downtown, Myeongdong, Namdaemun, Seoul Station, whatever, and coming this way. So we've got Chungmuro Station right below us. There's Gate 1 right there. So it was really, really cool when I found out that I could come along Chungmuro and come up these steps and just walk all the way straight to Jongno without going across crosswalks or worrying about vehicular traffic or stoplights or any of that. So I guess one thing I should mention while I'm near Chungmuro is that this area, this is where you'll find a lot of the print shops that I mentioned earlier. You know, off down toward the Seiwon Arcade, that's a lot of electronic stuff. And then over by the Cheonggae Arcade, there's a lot of, and the Daerim Arcade right next door, that was Daerim Construction Company, by the way, the Daerim Arcade and the Cheonggae Arcade. By those buildings, you've got a lot of the metalworking shops and machine shops and things like that. And here, this is where you'll find a lot of print shops. And if you walk the alleyways here, you can see like forklifts carrying pallets and boxes full of printed stuff. And there's also a number of like plaque shops around here. So if you're looking to buy a plaque, like, you know, when somebody leaves your company and you give them a plaque with their name on it and whatnot, you can order those from several places around here. You can find planners and diaries, things like that, all kinds of stuff in this area. You know, one thing I forgot to mention about the Hotel PJ, the Pungjeon Hotel, the original name, the Pungjeon Hotel, was the last of the 8 buildings to get official approval to open to the public, and that happened in 1982. So, you know, having wandered around the Skyway on the north side, the north end and the south end, you can see that, you know, all the activity happens on the north end. There's really, you know, here in the middle, the Sampung Nexus and the Hotel PJ, it's just the walkway. There's no shops there, nothing to see. And in the last block, you just got those apartments, basically. There's not a lot of reason to hang out there. But the place where you'll see the most people is right here in the Daerim Arcade and the Cheonggae Arcade, because this is where you find a lot of cafes and bakeries and a couple of restaurants and I think a bar, some other stuff. So there's plenty of reason to hang out here. So this is where the people are. If you're wondering why would I want to go to Seiwon Plaza, aside from just seeing a bit of history and getting a look at it, this is it right here. Look at this. Every place is almost full, but pretty much full. There's a little kind of a donut shop right up here. You see that line there? I was there the other day, and there was a 20-minute wait after you order. So I didn't have time, so I didn't stay. I haven't tried this place yet. So we've come back to the Sehun arcade now, and you know, all the shops are closed. Yesterday when I came by here, they were all open. And I want to show you one last thing, because you know, despite the downside of redevelopment and demolition, there is an aspect to it that is extremely interesting. And we're going to take a look at that right now. This is one of the coolest parts of walking this Skyway. For me, I love seeing this. There's a construction site here that I've passed by numerous times. It's been here for quite a while now. And I had no idea what was on the other side of the barriers that they put up until I came up to this deck. Check that out. How cool is that? These are, you know, foundations of buildings from the Joseon Dynasty era. And you can see, you know, the outline of little alleyways, I guess, where they would walk. And so many buildings, the foundations, buildings and walls and whatnot. So the name Sehun comes from the Chinese characters for world and luck, fortune. And I'm going to apologize. I've probably been mispronouncing it on and off throughout the whole video. I know I sometimes say Sehun because the W in the romanization will throw me off every time. Sehun is global fortune. And you know, that tells you when they first built this place, there was some optimism, I guess, for what this would become, what it would mean for the city and for the area. But obviously that didn't quite pan out. And as far as the people around Sehun-sanga, it hasn't been such good fortune for them in the long run either. And you know, this area here where they're uncovering all these old Joseon Dynasty foundations used to be kind of a hot spot for watches, right? And there's some little carts up here just outside the wall. So to me, this place kind of is symbolic of, you know, the tension between the old and the new, the revitalization versus redevelopment, you know, preservation versus progress. And I have nothing, you know, deep or insightful or provocative even to say about that subject. I'm not here to persuade you of anything. I just wanted to show it to you. And I hope it gives you some interest in the topic that encourages you to go out and read up more about it on your own and, you know, kind of figure out where you stand on the whole thing. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you as always for watching. Thank you for liking. Thank you for subscribing. I hope you found this helpful and useful. And if you didn't, well, maybe you'll find something in the next one. So I'm out. Thank you. Bye-bye.